Oh, shine on, always smooth up in the sky.
Once again, welcome to the first program of our season. Jean Elson is Senior Lecturer Emerita in the Department of Sociology at UNH. She has received teaching awards from the V-Day Committee and from the LGBTQ community. She taught classes and lectured on topics of gender, family, women's health and illness, and sexual behavior. Jean was also an appointed member of the UNH President's Commission on the Status of Women. She holds a PhD in sociology and a master's in sociology and women's studies from Brandeis University. And she's written several books, one of which she is here to speak about. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jean. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great crowd here. I'm very impressed that you have this many people who've shown up. I want to thank the Exeter Historical Society, especially Laura Martin. We've been talking about this for over a year, I think, in terms of having me come here. And I'm very happy and thankful that you invited me to come here and talk about my book. I am very familiar with the Exeter Historical Society. I happen to be a big fan of the Exeter History Minute. I just want to always happy to see that come into my inbox. It's always an interesting story. So thank you for that. This is my book, Gross Misbehavior and Wickedness. This book, and I will be explaining the title, Gross Misbehavior and Wickedness, tells the story of Nina and James Walker, who wed hastily and enthusiastically in February 1897. And eventually, they waged a protracted and acrimonious court battle to dissolve that marriage from 1909 through 1916. 7 long years for that divorce. The narrative has several twists. Every legal victory for one side was appealed by the other side, and this is why it took so long. The Walker divorce hearings took place in Newport, Rhode Island, but newspaper reports, gossip about the Walkers' marital troubles created really a sensation throughout the entire nation. And the Walker divorce case was attracted widespread attention, mostly because these were antagonists who both came from very prominent American families. And I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. So you have to imagine a time before the internet, if you can possibly do that. The form of social media that was popular at that time was the newspaper, right? This was the golden age of journalism. And people who read the newspaper were particularly interested in the often lurid accounts of high society divorces, and the Walker case was certainly one of these. The Walker case has an interesting cast of characters who I'll introduce you to. This distinguished young man is Lieutenant James Wilson Grimes Walker, and yes, he had 2 middle names. One was not enough. This is James Walker. He was the son of Admiral John Walker, who was well known at the time as a Civil War hero. And you may have heard of him. President Theodore Roosevelt had appointed his father, Admiral Walker, as chairman of the Nicaragua Canal Commission. This was the commission to see if a canal could be dug through Nicaragua. This is before the Panama Canal. So James' father was appointed as the head of that. Eventually, 2 destroyers were named after the admiral. You can imagine that it was extremely difficult for this son, the eldest son, to live in the shadow of such a renowned and famous man. I think that this may have been the source of many of Jane's problems. This is the Admiral. It's not a walrus, it's the Admiral. Very distinguished looking. He has been referred to, and was referred to at the time, in Washington, D.C. circles as the old man of the sea. He certainly looks the part. And I have to tell you that the hair hanging on his face, that style was even out of date at the time that he wore it. But he was considered to be, a distinguished admiral. So it was difficult for James to live up to his father. However, there are some perks to having a powerful father. And through his father's influence, James became a naval engineer in Central America with the Canal Commission. I think we refer to that as nepotism. And later, he even wrote a book about his experiences. Okay, so there's the Admiral, his father. This lovely lady is Rebecca White Pickering Walker. She was James' mother, and she is descended from the Pickering family of Salem, Massachusetts, and I'm sure you've heard of the Pickering family. I actually did a talk at the Pickering house last year about the Pickering aspect of this story. Rebecca may look like a nice, kindly old lady, but I can assure you that she was not. Rebecca Pickering Walker was a petite woman who was rumored to control not just her husband, who was an admiral, don't forget, but also her adult children. She loved to get involved in their lives. And there is a letter in the book from Rebecca to her son just prior to his marriage to Nina, where she really goes into an entire rant about the speed with which this marriage is proceeding, her objections to the marriage. Can you imagine, this is right before the marriage. Very indignant letter to him prior to the wedding. So she was not on board completely from the beginning. I think mainly because she wasn't involved in the planning, and these two young people were planning to get married in a hurry, etc. Also among the supporting characters in this divorce story were James Walker's siblings, and the most prominent of these was Susan Grimes Walker FitzGerald. Susan Grimes Walker FitzGerald was a very well-known women's rights advocate of the time. Very active not only in Massachusetts in the battle for women's votes, but nationally as well. And to me, Susan played what I would think would be a very unexpected role in the case. So that is Susan, and here we have the entire Walker family. I think this is a very interesting picture. I got this picture from the Walker family. So you see, well, of course you recognize the Admiral, how could you miss him? And this is Walker. And then actually this is Susan on that side of James. And then he had two other sisters, Frances and Sarah. And this is James, towards the front is James' younger brother, Henry. And if you look at that photograph and you see the contrast between James and his brother, I think it's a very interesting contrast there. I'll tell you later, I've been in touch with descendants of the family, and a descendant of actually Henry. He is the fourth Henry Walker, same name. And he had some insights about the relationship between the sons and their father also in terms of their inability really to live up to this man who was so famous and so prominent. Okay, so now we have Nina on the other side of this case. And this is Nina Chinn Walker, dressed, I'm assuming, very fashionably for her day. She was descended from a family that was related to George Washington in two separate ways. You can't get much closer to American royalty, right, than being related to George Washington. And her nuclear family was all women. Okay, her father was not in the family. Her mother had separated from him very early on. So her nuclear family included a very strong-willed grandmother, as well as her mother, whose name was Virginia Sarolina Chinn. I unfortunately don't have a picture of her. And an older sister whose name was Bertha, who staunchly remained single. And Bertha had some very strong ideas, not just about marriage, but also about her sister's marriage and about her sister's husband. This matriarchy, really, that Nina grew up in was Nina's main support during the many years she fought for her divorce. This is a very interesting picture. This is during the courting days, because remember, James and Nina got married in 1897. So this is during their courting years. That Nina in the front with James and Bertha in back of them. There's a very interesting story behind this picture. This picture and the one before it, this picture of Nina, actually came from an amateur historian, a woman in California who collects old scrapbooks, and she went to a garage sale just a few years ago while I was in the process of writing this book, and found this old album in California. The family was not from California, although one of the daughter actually moved there later in life. It was just, somebody's old scrapbook, and she located it and contacted the Pickering family, who contacted me about it because we were in touch. And we wouldn't have these photographs if not for this woman who went to a garage sale. So you would never know. Just amazing. Just to tell you a little bit more about Nina's mother, she was a very strong, independent woman. Her name was Virginia Sarolina Wood Chinn. She had, as I mentioned before, separated from her own husband when her children were very young. And an interesting part of this case was when the James attorneys tried to say that if, in fact, Nina got her divorce, then divorce would be passed down genetically to the Walker children. Well, of course, Nina's mother had separated from her father, okay? Nina was trying to divorce her husband. And so, this genetic trait might result in what they refer to as hereditary divorce. You have to realize that this was the turn of the last century. Genetics was just becoming very popular as an explanation for just about anything. I do have to tell you, my son happens to be a geneticist, and he assures me that divorce is not in genes, just in case you're wondering, but it is something that James' lawyers did try to prove. Okay, this became a very antagonistic relationship between James and his wife's family. And actually between the two families, between the Walker family and the Chinn family. At one point it got so bad that James tried to sue his mother-in-law and sister-in-law for alienation of affection, which is usually a charge that's reserved for a lover who alienates the affections of the spouse. But in this case, James tried to say that this was the mother and the sister who were taking his wife away from him. So no love lost there. Okay, so now we have a mystery woman in this story. Don't have a picture of her. This is Mabel Cochrane, She was a young working class woman who was accused of having an extramarital sexual relationship with James Walker. Okay? We, again, don't have much information on Mabel. Not just a photograph, but not much information. Again, she was a working class woman. She wasn't in the papers like the Walkers were or like the Chinns were. What we know about her is from letters that she wrote to James. And again, I'll tell you about those. And in one very sensational aspect of this case, Mabel Cochrane was persuaded to undergo a physical examination by Dr. Sarah Ellen Palmer, woman physician, to determine whether or not she was a virgin and whether or not she had contracted gonorrhea. Okay. This is where our Exeter connection is. You knew there was one, right? Okay, so here she is. Dr. Sarah Ellen Palmer was a native of Exeter, New Hampshire. She, a very, very interesting woman. She was an orphan at a very young age. She was raised by relatives in Exeter, attended Robinson Seminary, which I know you're familiar with, graduated from there in 1876, and then she must have been educated very well at Robinson Seminary because she went on to receive a medical degree from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. So women were not allowed to go to regular medical school, but this was a very distinguished women's medical college. Dr. Palmer, just to tell you a little bit, because I know she's, a neighbor, Dr. Palmer was the first woman member of the American Academy of Medicine. She was also the first woman surgeon to specialize in women's diseases. At the time of the Walker trial, Dr. Palmer had a private practice on Beacon Street in Boston, but she maintained very strong ties to Exeter and was very connected to some of the important figures who lived in Exeter. She's buried here, right in the cemetery in Exeter. And Dr. Palmer's testimony was pivotal in this divorce case. This is a slide, this is from the New York Times. Dr. Sarah Ellen Palmer, you can see women doctors testify. The co-respondent in the Walker divorce case was Mabel Cochrane, who I told you about. And this is how prominent this case was. This was in the New York Times. Dr. Sarah Ellen Palmer was the person who had examined Nina, and there were other doctors who also testified about the evidence. Many, many doctors. I found lots of information on Dr. Palmer right here in the basement at Exeter Historical Society. Thank you for that. And I thank Barbara also for her help with that. I don't know if she remembers, this was several years ago. But very interesting woman, and as a matter of fact, my research on her got me interested in this case to begin with, so the whole origin of this. So I'm going to go back, rewind, and start at the beginning of this story, which I'm going to start with the marriage. Okay, so here is the wedding announcement. This wedding announcement appeared not only in papers in Washington, D.C., but again, people from across the country. Social networking. This was in papers across the country as well. And a picturesque, I'm sure, I don't know if you can read that, but a picturesque wedding event at Old Rock Creek, okay, Rock Creek Church. And that headline for that society column was the wedding of Nina and James. They were married in a beautiful Washington, D.C. society wedding in February of 1897. This wedding was attended by government leaders, many financially and socially successful guests, you know, the connections through the Admiral and also from Mrs. Chinn's family. By all accounts, it was a lovely affair, but unfortunately, it did not take long for marital troubles to develop. Nina gave birth to the couple's first child, a little girl named Elizabeth, in Washington, D.C., only 9 months after the wedding. She was staying with her mother and her sister, while James was in New York working for the Canal Commission. Remember the job that he got through his dad? Okay. And at the time that she gave birth to this little girl, she wanted James to come and see her, see the new baby. This was their first child. James told her he was too busy with his work for the Canal Commission to come to see her. And he left for Nicaragua with the Canal Commission shortly afterwards. Well, you can imagine how this went over. And this was such, you know, this was such an affront that even Mrs. Walker got involved, even James' own mother. This is a telegram from James Walker's mother, begging her son, please get in touch with your wife. Please tell her you're happy about the baby. I mean, for the mother-in-law, who wasn't crazy about this whole marriage to begin with, to actually involve herself and to, you know, beg her son to contact his wife. Something was not right there from the beginning. While her husband was away in Nicaragua, Nina became much more dependent, of course, on her mother and her sister. She's got this brand new baby. She's all alone, so she's living with the mother and the sister. She was not reunited until James returned from Nicaragua 10 months later. So if you can imagine, he goes away, brand new baby, comes back 10 months later. I think that Nina never really forgave her husband for his lack of attention at this time. And I think that had a major effect. This is right at the beginning of their marriage. And as a result of James' neglect, as I said, she got closer with her mother and her sister, who she was very dependent on, and this was one of the issues in the marriage that James was not happy about, the fact that she had gotten close with her mother and sister. Okay, so Nina Walker gave birth to 4 children in 4 years. So even with the 10-month absence, they were able to fit 4 children into 4 years. And Nina did have problems with a couple of the pregnancies along the way. After the birth of her 4th child, Nina abruptly terminated sexual relations with her husband. Remember, this was a time when if you had marital relations, sexual relations, it was very likely you were going to get pregnant. There was not reliable birth control. And Nina believed that the health problems that she had horrible stomach problems. She believed that those health problems were caused by her many pregnancies, and she was not going to have any more of this. She adamantly did not want more children. As a matter of fact, she hadn't even wanted the 4th child, although once he was born, she loved him and she cared very much about him. But she was in the situation that women were at this time, where she had no control over her fertility. And so the only way for her to stop having children was to stop having sexual relationships. This became a point in the trial. And the fact that Nina did not, and was not shy about saying that she did not want more children, was considered very shocking at the time. There was testimony not only by James, but also by Nina's mother-in-law, that Nina had said this, that she didn't want any more children, and this idea that a woman would not accept, you know, another pregnancy and all the children she could possibly have was really used against her. On the other hand, Bertha, Nina's sister, got involved here as well. And in a letter that she wrote to Jane's mother, which is, of course, in the book, she recalled that James had stated that if his wife would not submit to his sexual demands, he would find other women who would. So that was set up in that point. When James finished his work on the Canal Commission, he was sent to the Boston Navy Yard, and Nina claimed that while he was stationed there, he thought constantly about questionable women, and that he often bragged about these women to their friends. Nina also asserted, and this is a direct quote, that James kept constant companionship with lewd persons and expressed a preference for lewd and loose females. Most seriously, Nina later accused James of carrying on an improperly close relationship with Mabel Cochrane, a pretty young woman who was a waitress in a restaurant that was near the Boston Navy Yard. And there's a whole story about how she met James and how they became, in James' view, friends, but in Nina's view, something a lot more than that. James Walker's next posting for the Navy was in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Naval Yard, and James admitted later that he had requested duty in South Carolina to get further away from Nina's mother and sister. During his first summer in Charleston, while Nina and the children were away, Nina took the children to the mountains to get them away from the heat in Charleston during the summer. And James received what he said was a surprise visit from, guess who? Yes, Mabel Cochrane and her brother, who was looking for a job at the Naval Yard. Well, being so gracious, James invited Mabel and her brother to stay with him at his house for several weeks while the wife and children were away. There was later disagreement about exactly where it was that Mabel slept. And James later, when the family returned, while the family was away, he hired Mabel as a housekeeper. He said he needed a housekeeper to, take care of things in the house. And then when Nina and the children returned, he decided that he would hire Mabel as a governess for his children. Well, Nina was not pleased about this. She was particularly incensed. At first, it wasn't because at first that she thought that there might be a relationship between James and Mabel. It was because she felt that Mabel was completely unfit to be a governess for her children. She said about Mabel, the woman only reads novels. How can she be a governess? Then, a little bit later, James was sent to Washington, D.C. on naval business, and he stayed at the home of his mother in Washington. Never one to stay out of trouble with the family, James' mother invited Mabel to come and stay at her house while James was there. Yeah, that's exactly how Nina felt. Exactly. Nina was, she lost it. She rushed to Washington, D.C., accused Mabel of getting special treatment, said that she was being ignored. This led to a huge blow up, as you can imagine. And Mabel was sent packing. However, we're not finished with Mabel yet. After she returned to Boston, Mabel and her former employer exchanged letters. So she and James wrote to each other. And Nina later discovered these letters. It's unclear in the book. There's several stories about the way in which Nina discovered these letters. Unclear as to whether James had hid them well or wanted her to see them. It's not quite clear. But when Nina saw these letters between Mabel and James, she described them as of an improper and lascivious nature. During the divorce hearings, the letters were read out loud in court to the embarrassment not only of James, but of his entire family. And parts of these letters were reprinted in newspapers. I was able to get a hold of the actual letters, which were in the court record. A whole other story about how I got those. Some of them had been ripped to shreds by Nina and then pasted together to be used as evidence. James, of course, was very embarrassed, and he claimed that these were not really letters from Mabel, that Nina had doctored them and made them look worse than they were. But here's an example. There's several letters in the book. Here's an example of one of these letters. I don't expect you to read them. I'm going to read you an excerpt from this letter. So this is from Mabel, my dear Mr. Walker. And here's an excerpt from page 2. And you can decide for yourself what you think about this. Have you dreamed of me lately? I dreamed of you last night. That is why I am writing to you tonight. Well, I am still true to you, but I feel pretty nervous sometimes and wish you were here with me. I never used to feel that way, but I guess it is because I love you. Have you heard the new song? I want to tell you, babe, how much I love you. It is very pretty. I would sing it to you tonight if I only had you here. Well, I hope you are as true to me as I am to you. I guess I shall have to look you over to see if you have been jollied. Make up your own definition. Jolly. Do you think you would bear inspection? No. Yes. Well, it's a shame to tease you, but this is just the way I feel. I must go to bed now and see if I can have another dream like last night. Well, Mabel's letters could be interpreted as love letters, alluding not only to a romantic relationship between Mabel and James, but a sexual one was suggested. So again, we don't know what jolly means, so we can guess. So when Nina found these letters, she was terribly shocked, and she consulted with family members, her own family and also with James' family as well. And she was on the verge of ending her marriage at this point. You know, this was another woman with her husband. However, fate intervened. Now, it took a long time for the Walkers' divorce to take place, but it also took a long time for Nina to finally decide to pursue a divorce. And in this case, the marriage was saved for the time being as an unintended consequence of James Walker's involvement in a nationally reported scandal. So this was a military scandal that was, again, in all the papers. Secretary Bonaparte was the Secretary of the Navy. Yes, he was a long-term descendant of Napoleon, actually. Side story. But as a civil engineer in charge of repairs at the Charleston Navy Yard, James took it upon himself to be a hero, and he stood up to the construction company, claiming that they were bilking the government out of money on the repairs that they were making, that they were using inferior cement, etc. And this became a widely publicized story. This was during the Progressive period. Everybody was looking for a scandal. Everybody was looking for a hero who would defend the public. And after this public accusal of this corrupt contractor, the United States President got involved, the Naval Secretary got involved, and James became a celebrated populist hero of the time. So here he is in his private life, having an issue, and being this hero in public life. So despite the fact that Nina claimed that when she found the letters, these are her words, stabbed her heart like a poisoned arrow, which I'm sure they did. Nina did decide not to pursue divorce at this time. Perhaps because he had become a national hero, she felt, well, maybe he was a good guy, and regardless of what he did in his private life, she should stick with him. But also, if you think about it, it would have been a very awkward moment to expose the Walkers' domestic quarrels. You know, how do you divorce someone who everybody else thinks is a hero? And so, although Nina had been furious, obviously, with her husband, a temporary marital truce was reached for the next few years. Next, James was sent to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Nina really did not want to go to Brooklyn, New York, and refused to leave Washington, D.C. and go there. And once again, James Walker's parents stepped in. The Admiral and his wife took what seems to me to be dramatic action. They actually kidnapped the children, the Walker children, and took them to Brooklyn in an attempt to force Nina to come to Brooklyn herself. And after her children were in Brooklyn, Nina did grudgingly go there. While she was there, James engaged in what Nina felt was further scandalous behavior, and tension increased again between the couple. Nina was very relieved when her husband's next post was the Portsmouth Naval Yard. Okay, so she hated Brooklyn, loved Portsmouth. This is a picture of downtown Portsmouth. I bet you can recognize it. At about the time that the Walkers were living here. You know, in some ways it looks very different, but you can recognize buildings. You can see the church there. So this is where the Walkers came at this point in their marriage. The Walker family, James' family, had roots in New Hampshire. Admiral John Grubbs Walker was actually a native of Hillsborough. And he had also been posted at the Portsmouth Naval Yard while the children were young. And James and his siblings grew up while the father was posted in Portsmouth. From a letter that I was able to get from one of the descendants, it's obvious that Mrs. Walker had a little trouble handling James when he was a young boy, and he was sent off to school at St. Paul's Academy in Concord. Straighten him out, I guess. But he certainly visited the Naval Yard during school holidays. So James, Nina, and their children returned to the Portsmouth area when James was also stationed in Portsmouth beginning in March 1907. This was not a coincidence that they were at the Portsmouth Naval Yard. James' elderly father, the Admiral, and his mother were living in a gunboat at the time. And the Admiral had the power to make sure that James was transferred to a post nearby. Nina later wrote that the Navy looked upon Portsmouth as one of the choice stations. And she loved Portsmouth so much that she and James entered into another temporary truce for a couple of years. Just to tell you a little bit about Nina's feelings about Portsmouth, she talked about Portsmouth as where she experienced, she said, the fullness of a woman's life in the service. The officers and their families, and also the people of Portsmouth, I found friendly and gracious. Quite something for a Southerner to say about Northerners, right, at the time. They accepted me as one of them with their hospitality and sincerity. The Walkers even sent their oldest two children, Elizabeth and Graham, to the public school in Portsmouth, no private school for them. And Nina described the public school as a fine building conducted by cultivated teachers. She felt this was in contrast to Brooklyn, New York, where she would not send her children to school. So Nina found the town of Portsmouth, and these are her words, is unique and especially satisfying to a lover of the beautiful. She enjoyed what she called the bracing climate and the happy surroundings, and loved the cold, crisp days with deep snow on the ground. So this was quite different. She had grown up in Virginia, quite a bit warmer during winter. Nina considered what she called the robust Portsmouth climate to be the major reason that the Walker family never needed to call a physician during her years here. We'll have to remember that in the coming months. Right? A couple months from now, just think it's a robust climate. You're not going to have to call a doctor. Okay. Anyway, Portsmouth was the last place that the Walker family lived in harmony. And actually, the calm before the storm is what Nina called Portsmouth. Perhaps a naval analogy there, the calm before the storm. Admiral Walker died, and James and his family were transferred again from Portsmouth soon afterwards. Nina wrote that she left warm and sincere friends both in the city of Portsmouth and in New York when the family left in May 1908. Again, she referred to Portsmouth as the calm before the storm. James' next assignment was in Newport, Rhode Island at the Naval Training Station. And things did not go well there between Nina and James. And finally, Nina decided that she would start divorce proceedings. Wife leaves naval officer. Again, headlines. These were well-known families, that the marriage had been in the newspapers. Why wouldn't the separation and divorce be in the newspapers? So this was, this is the New York paper. This was across the country. There's a whole discussion here about how was the wife able to leave without her husband's permission. How was she able to sneak out? And it's true, she actually did sneak out, taking her children and her possessions, and James would say some of his possessions as well. And she really had a whole setup where she was able to keep him away for a few hours and gathered up her children and her things. And the Naval Training Station was on an island, Coasters Island, so they had to take a boat to the mainland. And they went, Nina and the children went to a house that her mother had rented, came down from Washington, D.C., came up from Washington, D.C., and rented this house with the sister Bertha, specifically so that Nina could create residency in Rhode Island and pursue charges of divorce. Why did Nina finally decide to divorce her husband at this time? Well, she had further conflicts with her mother-in-law, which was never helpful. But also Nina became more suspicious again about her husband's infidelity. James purchased a motorcycle while in Newport that and so he could make frequent visits to Boston. Boston, who was in Boston. Okay, so you're ahead of me here. Okay, so Nina claimed that the reason he wanted to go to Boston was to see his inamorata, was the term. I had to look this up, actually. Inamorata, female lover, Mabel Cochrane. Okay, so that was what she claimed. In addition to this, for the first time, Nina discovered through a doctor some shocking information about James Walker's health. James had suffered from a malady for many years. Nina was very sympathetic. He told her it was some benign condition. At this time, Nina found out that what he actually had was gonorrhea. So gonorrhea, sexually transmitted disease. They were called venereal diseases at the time. Some of you may have heard that term. Gonorrhea was so shocking that the term gonorrhea could not be used in the newspapers. So in newspaper reports of the trial, there were descriptions of James having contracted a mysterious disease. Could not talk about the fact that it was gonorrhea. And Nina probably realized at this time, remember Nina had had these horrible stomach problems for years. I highly suspect that the horrid stomach problems that she had suffered was probably pelvic inflammatory disease, PID, that was caused by infection from her husband's gonorrhea. Don't know that for sure, but having done a lot of research about women's health, it sounds like it's likely that that's what happened. And Nina probably made this connection as well, that this was a matter of her health at this point. So, Nina was in Rhode Island, and it was fortuitous for Nina that she was in Rhode Island. And she tried very hard to establish residency in Rhode Island. Again, her mother rented a house so she could live there while she pursued a divorce. Why did she fight so hard to pursue her divorce in Rhode Island? I was wondering about this, and I was talking with some people before about laws. Marriage law and divorce law has always been state law in the United States. I'm sure you're aware of that. And Rhode Island was a place for Nina to file for divorce because prior to no-fault divorce laws, which changed in the mid to late 20th century, divorce was an even more adversarial process than it is now, if you can imagine. And divorces were awarded only if one spouse could prove the other guilty of wrongdoing in violation of the marriage contract. So this was set up as an adversarial relationship. There was an accuser, there was a defendant. It was almost like a criminal trial. And common grounds for divorce were adultery, desertion, failure to provide, extreme cruelty. Well, Nina tried to prove adultery, but that was very difficult to prove. She didn't have actual proof that there had been actual adultery, and in some cases it required witnesses. greater proof. However, in Rhode Island, of all the places that the Walkers had lived, there was a particular reason for divorce that existed no place else in the United States. Only in Rhode Island could divorce be obtained for gross misbehavior and wickedness. Sound familiar? And either of the parties repugnant to and inconsistent with the marriage contract. So if she couldn't prove adultery, Nina and her lawyers felt she could prove gross misbehavior and wickedness. These terms were vague enough that it left room for broad interpretation. And gross misbehavior and wickedness became an important allegation in the Walker case, hence the name of the book. And Nina could cite several shocking charges that could fit into this broad category. Adultery was much more difficult to prove. Nina also, at this time, was more ready to file for divorce because of another reason. Nina, although she didn't want more children, really loved the children that she did have and was very much involved with their life. There's a lovely picture, again, from the family of Nina and her children. There's Elizabeth, remember the oldest daughter, and the 3 little boys who came afterwards. And Nina was very concerned that if she filed for divorce, she would lose her children. As a matter of fact, James had taunted her about this. It said, you know, if you leave me, you won't have any contact with the children. Nina's mother-in-law had told her, you can leave, but you're not taking the children with you. This is because the presumption for custody, and remember this is over 100 years ago, the custody of children had traditionally been awarded not to mothers, but to fathers. This was based upon the concept that wives and children were property. Okay? They were property of the husband and the father. So if the marriage split up, the father was entitled to his property, his children. Okay? And so he was very afraid of losing her children. Just at this time, in 1909, when Nina did decide to file for divorce, courts had begun awarding custody to mothers. The idea of the tender years and the mother should be the caretaker of the child. And so there was this possibility that opened up to Nina that she could divorce her husband and keep her children. That was a very important development that also convinced Nina to initiate divorce proceedings. And there were courtroom testimonies by the 2 eldest Walker children that were, of course, very heart-wrenching moments in the case. And even the judge found it very difficult to hear the testimonies of the children. He was a father himself. He found the testimonies very upsetting in court. Here's the house in Newport. Obviously, this photo was taken by me more recently, just a few years ago, but this is the house on Rhode Island Avenue where Nina lived with her children and her mother and her sister while she does this look familiar to somebody? Is this maybe your country house? Or that's the house on Rhode Island where Nina lived in order to establish residency in Rhode Island and where she pursued her divorce. As I told you previously, the Walker divorce extended for over 7 years, from 1909 through 1916. Each decision decision would be made for Nina's side, it would be appealed by James. Decision would be made for James' side, it would be appealed by Nina. Testimony in the case was often shocking to the public, and again, they were following it on social media and the newspapers. Thanks to Dr. Palmer's testimony regarding her examination of Mabel The topic of Mabel's contested virginity led to many legal and medical debates in the courtroom during the Walker trials. And the word virginity was never used, okay? The term that was used was innocence. Again, like gonorrhea could not be printed in the newspaper. There were over 20 doctors who testified at this trial. Back and forth, back and forth. Again, based upon Dr. Palmer's examination, different interpretations of the examination that had only been made by Dr. Palmer. This medical testimony reveals a lot about 20th century ideas regarding gender, regarding sexuality, the concept of, what is a virgin, who is a virgin, and this became a major part of the case. At this point in the trials, a note of mystery was added by, again, our mystery woman, Mabel Cochrane. She was supposed to testify in court, and this was going to clear up the whole situation. Well, the time came for her to testify, and Mabel disappeared. Forever. We do not know what happened to Mabel after that. I tried to find her. There are a couple of Mabel Cochranes who might have been her, but we don't know. She took off. Okay? There were fervent attempts to find her. She was never found. I can't say that I blame her. Here was this young, working class woman caught between these two powerful families. She probably did what she felt was the best thing she could do and just left. And again, was never found. I'm sure she was found somewhere, but not by the principals in this case. And not by me either. Miss Cochrane flees Walker court case. And this, again, gives you an idea of how prominent this case was in the newspapers. The headline could just be, Miss Cochrane flees Walker case, and everybody knew, oh yeah, of course, that's Mabel Cochrane, she was accused, etc., etc. And so that was, this whole idea that she had disappeared, nobody knew where she went, etc. Okay. I've been asked to talk a little bit about my research for this book, so you already know that I did some research right here, basement, here on Dr. Palmer. And my research for the book in general was based upon very old newspaper accounts and the original century-old court documents. It was amazing that I was able to get hold of these court documents through a court clerk who, I can actually tell you the story. I tried to go through the archive, was unable to get these documents. And I just approached a clerk in the family court and, asked him if he could get the documents. And it was a 100-year-old case. And he said, well, I'll just put in for them. And I never had any idea that he was going to be able to get these. And I decided I would just call him back and thank him. A few weeks later, he said, where have you been? I've got all these documents waiting for you. 100-year-old documents with all the original evidence in this as well. Of course, I couldn't take it with me, but my assistant, also known as my husband, and I spent some time in Newport photocopying these documents. So I was also, that was, really a terrific source for me. Through persistence and a lot of luck, I was also able to access personal correspondence between the principals, Jane's and Nina's letters to each other, as you saw, letters from Mabel to James, and between other extended family members. I was also very fortunate to locate and interview the daughter of the Walkers' only daughter. Her name is also Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, remember the first child who had been born, was able to correspond with Elizabeth's daughter, a lovely and very intelligent woman, probably close to 90 now, who lives on the West Coast and knew a lot of things about this situation, and had really taken with her this feeling of resentment towards James Walker. It had been passed down, not through genetics, I guess, but from her own mother. And I was also able to speak with descendants of the other children, so the grandchildren of Nina and James, who in many cases have the same name, so the generational names were passed down. This was an incredible source of information. The Walker family was very generous, and I received photos from them, which are in the book. They're on my website, and I was really able to find out further insights about this family and what happened to members of the family. I'm always interested in what happens after the ending. I'm getting a time thing here, okay? And I am starting to wrap up. So I have to note, though, that stories that are told by descendants often need to be checked back. We all have family stories that get passed down, not necessarily the absolute truth. So I visited locations in Newport, where much of the story takes place. Also went to Brownfield, Maine. James resigned his naval commission during the divorce, and he retreated to Brownfield, Maine, which is just over the New Hampshire border. This is a photo of James when he was older. It comes from the Brownfield Historic Society. Thank goodness for historic societies. I was able, through the Brownfield Historic Society, to contact people who had heard about James when they were young children, and James was an older man. I actually was able to talk with an older woman who had been a servant in the boarding house where James lived. He was older in Brownfield, and she had some insights on him. This is James' barn, which has changed hands many times since then, and this was at one point the largest barn in the state of Maine. Just want to tell you a little bit about when I was nearing the end of the book. I thought that my research was more than complete. And a few weeks before the publisher's deadline, I heard from 3 additional Walker descendants. It turned out that each of them had part of what they referred to as Grandma Nina's diary. It wasn't a diary, but it was actually what had been a 600-page, handwritten, unpublished autobiography. So one descendant had a couple hundred pages, another descendant had another couple hundred, stuck in the back of a file drawer, in the attic, in a closet. There are still a couple hundred pages that were missing, but I mean, this was an amazing discovery. As you can imagine, it led me to do extensive last-minute revisions. Very stressful, but certainly worth it. Finding this document not only helped me add more detail and flavor to the story, but it really helped me to better understand Nina's character and her motivations. So I am starting to conclude now. I just want to say that the Walker divorce is a juicy story, but it is not just a juicy story. The Walker case raises issues that were not just personal problems of the Walkers. The story is particularly interesting because it unfolded at a time when social values and norms were transitioning from a very rigid Victorian era to a more enlightened period. The late 19th and early 20th century is often referred to as the progressive era, and it certainly was progressive, particularly in comparison to what happened before it. The Walker divorce story illustrates the cultural transformation that was taking place at the time, and eventually morphed into our contemporary American culture. Nina Walker and James Walker's story is a dramatic example of the increasing number of marital breakups that were occurring during this period of time. And they were occurring because of changing attitudes about marriage, changing attitudes about gender roles, and also about women's rights. Many of the issues in my book probably will seem familiar to you. Marital infidelity, problems with in-laws, disagreements about raising children are just some of the problems that we continue to grapple with in contemporary American culture. Further information on my book that's available on my website, jeanelson.com. There's also a discussion guide on the site for book groups, more photos, essays, information. I'm also happy if there's time to answer any questions, and I don't know, Laura, if you have time for that. Yes?
Do you have any letters from Nina to James when he was in Nicaragua?
No, I don't. I have letters from Nina to James later in their marriage, but not when he was in Nicaragua.
We don't know if there were. That's what I was wondering.
We don't. She complained of not receiving letters from him, but I do not know for sure. No. Any other questions? Yes?
Who got the children?
Who got the children? You want me to give you the spoiler? I'll give you the spoiler. Nina got the children. She did. Okay. At great sacrifice. I mean, there's more that went on with this divorce, and she did sacrifice a lot in terms of financial support in order to get her children. Yes?
If it was so difficult to have sex and not have children, how do you figure Mabel, if she did have sex with James, had no children?
I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. I wonder if what occurred between Mabel and James was actually reproductive sex. I'm not sure about that. You know, what is that whole discussion? I'm not sure about that. If there were other ways in which she maybe jollied him. Or maybe James Walker's claim that it was an innocent friendship could have been true. Or maybe, you know, there was information passed between these young girls. This was not unusual, I have to say. That's a whole other story. But these young working class girls who were away from their families for the first time, living on their own for the first time, it was not uncommon for these girls who really were very poor and needed patronage in some sense from wealthy men to have relationships with wealthy men. And I don't know what kind of, you know, information regarding what birth control there was might have been passed around then. But I think it's a very interesting question. Other questions? Yes?
Did they have alimony back then?
Oh.
Was there an alimony issue between?
Yes, and because, you know, at this time, to pursue divorce for a woman was very risky. Women at this time were almost middle-class women and upper-middle-class women and upper-class women were very financially dependent on their husbands. And so alimony would have been very important. And really, it was wealthy women, women who had money from their families, as Nina did, who were able to pursue divorce. And she was able to do this with, as I said, she sacrificed support from her husband in order to get her children. Poor women could not have done that, obviously. Yes?
What did were divorce lawyers expensive?
Yeah, they were just as expensive as they are now, relatively. She had quite a team, both sides actually had quite the teams of legal representation, and they were very, very expensive. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Do you know much about the whirlwind courtship and how they, what attracted them to each other in the first
No,
place?
wouldn't that be great to know?
Yeah.
I would love to know more about that, and I found out what I could from, Nina's, I want to call it an autobiography, but she didn't talk much about their meeting, just that she was looking in retrospect. She wrote it when she was older, and I have a feeling that all those lovely romantic moments might have been erased by her negative remembrance of this, but it would be great to know.
Did James remarry?
No, neither of them remarried. James became a gentleman farmer, retreated to Brownfield, Maine. He made a very famous speech, actually, from Brownfield, Maine. That's a whole other story, patriotic speech. But he was a loner from the beginning. That was one of the reasons that that Nina complained about him. That he wasn't a social person. And I think he enjoyed having a quiet life and retreating to Maine. Okay? Well, thank you so much.